So welcome everybody. We have people hopefully going to be joining us, um, and I'm expecting about 20 to 30 folks from joining us from different countries for this family diplomacy dialogue on climate change. This is part of a four-part dialogue series on the effects of different major issues on families across the world. Um, we have um, uh, we have the previous dialogue was on war and poverty. This dialogue is on climate change. The next dialogue is on gender-based violence, and then the last dialogue is on the impacts of the internet on families. So we're eager to hear from a variety of you joining us in some cases with your families, and I appreciate this, or with your friends. So Eric in Burundi, great to see you with your friends. And Izania Anthony, great to see you. I don't know where you're joining from with your mother, um, but it's good to see you. You're joining
Thank
us
you. Good
from where?
afternoon. Johnny from Nigeria.
From Nigeria or Niger?
Yeah.
From Nigeria?
Johnny from Nigeria.
You may want to keep your camera off for those of you who have issues with internet connection while you're not while you're speaking. At the very least, you may want to keep your camera off. But we will come back to you. So we want to start this dialogue with a couple of speakers. I think we're going to start with Dawn Friend. They're going to be speaking, and then Marlotte or Lottie. They're going to be speaking from their perspective as experts on climate change. And they'll each be speaking for about 8 minutes. And then afterwards, we're going to have open conversation. There's some of you that I'm going to be calling on for this conversation that will be that I know have some perspective from your respective places. And that includes Nusrat, who is joining us from Bangladesh. She is going to be speaking. Sami, who is joining us from Pakistan, is going to be speaking on the impacts of climate change on his family and his community. Eric from Burundi, and I believe Begum is joining us from Turkey and will be speaking on climate change from her perspective in Istanbul. But we definitely want to hear from as many of you as possible during this dialogue. So I hope that you are prepared to speak and not just listen, and that you take full advantage of the Zoom chat for you to share your comments. We have interns joining us from different places, and those interns are going to be contributing to the conversation. I think actually I forgot to mention Ian Bastida, who is also going to be speaking on the impacts of climate change as he experiences them in California in the United States. So without further ado, I'm going to have Don Friend introduce himself. And Don, you will have 8 minutes, and then we'll move to Lottie. We'll have 8 minutes, and then open conversation. Don.
Well, hello, everyone. I was about to say good morning, but you're everywhere around the planet. So good day, good evening, wherever you may be. I'm glad to be here with you. I am a professor of geography in the state of Minnesota. This is the northern part of the United States on the border with Canada, and it is springtime here. It's a nice warm day. All right. Do I have permission to share my screen? Because I have some slides for you.
You should.
Great. So now you're all just seeing yourselves, but let's get my PowerPoint. Here we go.
And while he's doing that, by all means, please introduce yourselves if you would. in the Zoom chat. Tell us what country and city you're coming from. We know some of you, but not necessarily all of you. And so it'd be great for you to introduce yourselves and tell us as much as you'd like about yourselves in the Zoom chat.
Okay, so here we go. I have just 8 slides. Hopefully I'll take 8 minutes or less. So I'm going to chat a little bit about, I'm not going to chat about the science of climate change. We know what's happening. It's getting warmer. Storms are getting stronger. Droughts are happening more often and lasting longer. We know this science part of it. So I'm going to chat a little bit more about the human side. I'm going to chat about climate migration and the result of climate change impacts on populations worldwide. And it's really just an introduction to this big subject. So the term climate migration is a little too polite. It's really climate displacement. People are displaced from their homes and not usually by choice. And so what is climate displacement? According to an organization here in the United States, a widely accepted definition, they say that called the National Resources Defense Council. Climate displacement is movement in part due to climate-related disasters, both sudden and slow onset disasters that are either temporary or permanent within countries or across borders. Now, when destruction of property occurs, displacement, it's inevitable for those who don't have the resources to cover the costs. So if your home is destroyed, what choice do you have but to move? If your school is not operating, if your job is not there, what choice do you have but to move? It's harsh. Now, today, or in 2022, the UN High Commission on Refugees says there are at least 36 million displaced by climate disasters. I think the number is quite a bit higher. And now this is part of at least 110 million displaced persons here on the planet right now. 100 million people, that's as many people as there are in some countries. And there are this many people that are displaced by climate and by other things. And very often armed conflicts that are happening now have their roots in climate change. And so these are going to be ongoing issues, very challenging for all people and for families, certainly. Now, displacement itself, messy, difficult to predict. When is there going to be a climate disaster? How bad will it be? How many people will be displaced? It's hard to predict this. But a few things we do know. We do know that most people move a short distance from their original home in an attempt to preserve their existing social and employment networks. It's what we would all do. Although sometimes people have to move further, they have to go to other countries, and families are broken up. Now, sometimes people move from one risky place to another, and sometimes this is due of lack of risk awareness, and sometimes it's because they're limited. They're not allowed to go to someplace safe. Many times people move they move twice. They'll move away and then they come back. So we know that this climate migration and climate displacement, it's not one directional. People go and come back. Sometimes they have to go to 2 or 3 different places, but people are trying to get back to where home is because that's what they're familiar with. It doesn't always work. Now, this is something else that is a very big deal around the planet now. Rural areas are likely to keep shrinking in population, and big cities or even medium-sized cities are likely to keep growing. Displacement feeds the existing trend of urbanization. But as I'll mention in a moment, this urbanization is not always pretty. Cities are not prepared to have millions of climate refugees. The infrastructure isn't there. And so what is happening in many, many cities is slum areas are expanding. And this is making it even harder. Now, the younger and the wealthier are likely to move first, leaving the poorer and older to bear increasing risks. One of the upcoming seminars or one of the upcoming online meetings in another few weeks will be the inequity involved in this. But across the world, the climate crisis disproportionately affects Black people, Indigenous people, other people of color, and especially women and children. The United Nations estimates that women make up 80% of climate refugees right now. Not only are women who are often caretakers more likely than men to experience poverty, which impedes their recoveries from climate disasters, but the risks of gender-based violence against women and girls rise in areas disrupted by climate change. Bad actors come in. So many of our societies around the world are patriarchal, patrilineal. So while the men are theoretically going and rescuing and saving and rebuilding, who's left at home are the women and the children, and they are taken advantage of by bad actors. There's gender-based violence, there's an increase in human trafficking. A lot of really ugly things happen because of climate-based natural disasters. Now, this is what I was mentioning about the urban environments. There are about 1 billion people living in slums. A quarter of all people who live in an urban area live in an area characterized by its lack of infrastructure. By 2050, it is projected that that number living in slums will increase to more than 3 billion people, or at least by live in urban areas lacking in infrastructure. Almost half the people living in cities and a third of all people will live in a slum without any meaningful access to clean water, sanitation, electricity, clinics, schools, transportation, or public space. So much of what we chat about with climate change, it's depressing, and it seems there is no hope. And what do we do? Well, I'm here to say, what do we do? So transformation from climate change, it's inevitable. This is happening. We know the science, but we are not doomed to climate chaos. We can choose how to transform. How do we adapt our societies? How do we adapt our economies? How do we adapt to climate change? How can we be resilient? We have the power to do this the right way. We already know the science. Generate solar power rather than fossil fuels, all these kinds of things. So it's time now for the people at the local and family levels to create effective climate resilience for the economy, society, and environment. And you here today are part of this. You are communicating how to be citizen diplomats to get this done. And it's going to take creation of political will, but we are not doomed to chaos. We can transform the way we want to. So those are my 8 minutes. Thank you very much.
Awesome, Don. Thank you. And we'll be coming back to you and to Lottie for kind of comment as we go about the open discussion. Lottie, you are next. And if you could introduce yourself and give us some background about you as well.
Yeah, of course. Hi, everyone. My name is Merlotte Diong. I go by Lottie. I'm a PhD candidate at University of Michigan, but I'm originally from the Netherlands. I've spent about 10 plus years living and working in Kenya. So I'm going to be talking about my sort of specific experiences there. And I do have a PowerPoint, so I'm going to try and share this. Can you all see my screen?
Yep.
Perfect.
Yes, we can.
Hopefully you're not seeing all of my notes.
We are not. You're displaying
Perfect.
properly.
Okay. So thank you everyone for the opportunity to speak to you all today. So I just wanted to introduce myself really quickly. I kind of gave the kind of basics, but I'm a PhD candidate at University of Michigan. My work really focuses on understanding how rural communities in Kenya are experiencing and coping with climate change. I've done most of my schooling in the US, so that explains my American accent, if you were wondering. But I'm really excited to engage with you all in today's conversation because my own work really foregrounds the experiences of families and households and holds those experiences as critical. So I'm planning to structure my contribution to the conversation today just by broadly first talking about how climate change is experienced differently by different people and how we can understand that through this lens of climate justice. And then I just want to give a few examples from my own work in Kenya about how climate change can affect families and then kind of wrap things up. So climate change is experienced very differently between and within countries, communities, and families in different places. So for some, climate change looks like droughts. For others, it's flooding. For some, it's heat waves. And for others, it's sort of intense and unseasonable storms. And some of this is caused by sort of the various physical geographies of the places. So we think about low-lying islands, they're going to be much more susceptible to sea level rise than mountainous regions. Arid or semi-arid locations are going to likely experience higher incidences of drought compared to sort of more tropical ecosystems. But what's really important to note is that regardless of how climate change is going to look like and is experienced at the local level, it's deeply intertwined with global patterns of inequality. So what this means is that the poorest and most vulnerable people tend to bear the brunt of climate change impacts, and yet they're contributing and have contributed the least to the problem. And so Dawn kind of already hinted at this, but globally, this means that the poorest countries tend to disproportionately experience the negative impacts of climate change. And these differences are caused by a number of things. So historic exploitation due to colonization, uneven development between and within countries, power imbalances, all of these things have come together to make it more difficult for certain communities to be able to respond to the impacts of climate change, as well as contribute their local knowledge to climate solutions. And even within countries, right, low-income communities, people of color, Indigenous people, people with disabilities, older or very young people, women, all of these groups can be more susceptible to the risks posed by climate change. So these ideas are often sort of collectively known as climate injustices. So for those that might not be familiar with the idea, climate justice as a movement recognizes these disproportionate impacts of climate change on low-income communities and communities of color around the world. And the reason that I wanted to sort of start off my talk today, bringing up this idea of climate justice, is that I think it's really essential as family diplomats, right, to recognize how climate change affects different people differently, and that those impacts can be much worse and more severe for those who are already dealing with a host of other challenges. So, you know, when people are struggling to get enough food for themselves or their families, or they're already experiencing conditions of racism or marginalization, their abilities to cope with the impacts of climate change are going to be much lower. And as family diplomats, I think that this is a really important thing to consider and recognize how these impacts of climate change for families around the world can look, and can look very different depending on people's identities. So far, what I've kind of been talking about has been a little bit abstract, and I think it can help to make some of these ideas a bit more concrete and a bit more real by bringing up some specific examples of the ways in which climate change can impact the family unit or the household. So as I mentioned in the beginning, my work has focused on coastal Kenya in an area called Kilifi County. So if you can see the map on the right side, it's that county that's sort of shaded in like a pink red. And Kilifi is an area where most people are engaged in jobs or livelihoods that rely on the environment. So things like fishing, farming, harvesting from the forest. They're involved in tourism, but that tourism is also very dependent on sort of wildlife and seasonal sort of experiences. And because of this, these groups are very susceptible to climate change, and the impacts that we're seeing on the ground are already quite severe. Sort of things like drought and unpredictable rain that's going to affect crop harvests, all the way to declining fish stocks or reductions in tourism, as the tourists don't want to come to a drought. And these changes have all had really significant financial and subsistence challenges for families. So what I saw I spent about 3 years living in Kenya doing research for my dissertation. And what I saw during that time is that families were actually splitting up as a coping strategy to reduce the financial burden on any one individual. So what that meant was that when times became particularly difficult, especially during the drought, women would often leave with the young children and migrate back to their home villages to live with their parents, while the men and the older children would typically either stay in the area or sometimes even move to other parts of Kenya or even abroad to try to find temporary work. And then what would happen is when the rains would finally come and the harvest would increase, and so household incomes would also rise, the families would then all come back together again. But these reunions were often really uncertain and sporadic because the people would describe really often about how, because of climate change, it had become virtually impossible to anticipate or predict when the rains would actually come. So what they were relying on for their livelihoods and what they were relying on to be able to bring their families back together was becoming almost impossible for them to know when that would come or not. And as I'm sure many of you can imagine, this sort of splitting up of the family creates a lot of stress and difficult emotions for families. So I wanted to put this one quote that a local fisherman told me because I think it really captures the way that a lot of people were speaking about this, which was, quote, "I worry all the time when my wife and children are away, but we have no other choice. If there's not enough fish, I can't provide for the family. This is better because at least we will all have food to eat." And then a second example that I want to highlight is the impact of climate change, and in this case, droughts, the impact that it had on women and girls within households in Kenya. So because of gender division of labor in Kenya, women and girls, like in many other places around the world, are primarily responsible for collecting the family's water for drinking, cooking, and washing. To give a bit of context, in this area on the coast, there's a really high saltwater table, which means that wells or boreholes that are dug quickly become way too salty to actually use for drinking water. And because of this, most families are completely dependent on the county's piped water, which brings water in from Kenya's inland areas onto the coast. But the challenge is that many, many areas and many communities will rely on the same water source, which means that as the dry season in Kenya has become even drier due to climate change, the amount of water that's available is significantly decreasing, which is making it even more difficult for women and girls to find enough water for their households. And this was something that was described to me a lot during my research, where women really highlighted the emotional strain that took on them. So for example, one of the quotes on the screen, a woman told me, quote, "I worry about my family having enough water. I worry because humans depend on water. Without water, we will die. Water is life." The only alternative that they had was to try and purchase water from private water providers, but these prices were sometimes 10 times what the public water would cost. And this forced families to make really difficult decisions about how and where to allocate already limited resources. So for example, the other quotation on the screen really captures this idea when a woman told me, quote, "I feel like crying when the tap is empty because then I have to go to the private water taps and pay money I don't have. So then my children will eat little that day or I can't pay their school fees." So to kind of wrap things up in the light of time, what I think is really important to note in both of these examples is that while climate change is significantly impacting families, it's rarely occurring by itself. Rather, the impacts of climate change actually intersects with these other challenges, things like poverty, inequality, price inflation, a lack of job opportunities, etc., to create even more hardships for families. And I think recognizing how climate change intersects with all of these different challenges is going to be really critical to understanding who is most affected by and vulnerable to climate change, and where can we actually be most effective with interventions that we want to create. So I think I'm a little bit over time, but thank you so much all for having the opportunity to speak with you. I hope it was interesting and useful, and I'm really looking forward to hearing and participating in the discussion. So thank you very much.
Awesome, Lottie. And before we open up discussion, and I do want to encourage you, as you might have seen, and I appreciate Aaron from Ghana and Begum from Turkey beginning to make comments in the Zoom chat. So you should really take advantage of the Zoom chat to pose comments, to respond to each other, and to ask questions. If you pose questions, I'll be going through this to check out your questions and see if we want to ask those questions to our speakers. But this is really intended to be a conversation, not just a response from our speakers. And so I really do encourage, and we're going to be coming to a number of you to get your thoughts. Because you're coming from different countries, you offer different perspectives on climate change, and that's part of the value of this family diplomacy work that we're doing. I want to actually, I forgot to introduce my partner's daughter, for those of you who she's sitting right next to me, and I'm hoping she will, I'm putting her on the spot, that she will chime in. She's 13 years old and is taking notes, and that's why she's looking down, because I've told her she gets ice cream if she takes notes and then participates and so on. So yeah, so likewise, I hope that you guys will all contribute to this conversation. But before we do this, I do need to take a photo of everybody. We document this work, and so for those of you who do not have your cameras on, I would greatly appreciate it if you could turn your cameras on at least briefly. So Joshua joining us from Uganda, Aaron from Ghana, Zachariah, Sage from the United States, Savannah, if you can turn on your camera in the United States, Michelle, likewise, and Roman, and Begum, if you can, would much appreciate you turning on your cameras. On 3, I'm going to have you guys smile, if you could. 1, 2, 3, smile. And hold on 1 second. I'm going to take one more photo because someone is just rejoining us. On 3, if you could smile. 1, 2, 3, smile. Fantastic. Okay, so who would like to start? And yes, just as Nusrat has done, if you could raise your hands, use the electronic hand if you can, that would be much appreciated. Eric, I think you raised your hand, Eric from Burundi, but if you could use the digital hand, that helps me to see who's next. So Nusrat is joining us from Bangladesh. She's actually one of our family diplomats, and has been impacted and has told stories about climate change. So she's a climate change activist. Nusrat.
Hi, everybody. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, so hello, everybody. And this is me, Nusrat from Bangladesh. And before starting, I just want to give the geographical location of mine because I think it's important. I live in the southern part of Bangladesh, and the city name is Borishal. And it's a one sort of coastal city, we can say, because sea is very near to us and it's surrounded by different types of water bodies. So I think that's the starting point of climate change, because as we live near to the sea and we often face different sort of natural disasters because of climate change. And I would say we have all sort of natural disasters: floods, cyclones, super cyclone, storm, and riverbank erosion. So we have tons of problems. And because of it's getting more industrial city day by day, and because of the deforestation, the temperature is really high. And last year we experienced 42 degrees centigrade, and it was and this year we are supposed to get more, and I guess maybe a 43 or 45. And so yeah, that's the thing. And we have, as I said, like we have all sort of problems. And I was thinking when the Dawn said like about the climate migration, and this is, I think, the perfect example. And Bangladesh have this example, I would say, and because of the riverbank erosion, especially due to increasing the temperature, and the pattern of rainfall has changed a lot, and we experience more rain nowadays. And just because of that, and we often get the rainfall, and that causes the riverbank erosion, especially those who live in the riverside. So we can see the people, they are just migrating to my capital city, and they're living in the slum, and they're facing so many problems, especially the water problem, having the problem of sanitization, and also they are facing the gender violence and so many problems. And that's the perfect example. Even I have seen in front of me, there are tons of families, and they lost everything. They moved to the capital city, living in the slum. They lost their profession. They were once they were very rich, and they were very rich farmer, and they had the profession, but they lost everything. So this is the perfect example, I would say. But I have a question to Dawn, that how can we mitigate this problem? I mean, this climate migration. And now I just want to move to my family, how it affects to my family, as I don't have much time. So my family, especially my parents, and they live in a one-story building. And as I said, like we often get the floods and natural disasters and other issues. So they are facing the waterlogged, and it's the most common problem of them. And as I'm the only child of them, so I can't visit often to them, because I also do work and live in another place of my city. So they often face this problem. They couldn't move when it's like flat. And most of the houses here, it's a one-story house. And also another problem that my mother, and she has been facing for a long time, it's because of her lung disease. And it is supposed to have the more problems, more health related issues, especially the respiratory problem and also the lung problem, those who living in the hot temperature. So as the temperature is really high, so she got the severe problem of lung disease. And last year she was almost dying, we can say. So that moment, I think it was just, I don't know how we survived. And still her condition is not so good. So that's the thing. And when it's like summer, now it's summer, and the temperature is really high, and she also feeling very bad because of the weather. And I want to mention one more thing is like here we don't have the air conditioning service in our home. So it's not common as like the other countries, because as is the developed countries, and it's a little bit expensive also at the same time. So we actually don't have everyone these services in our home. So that's the way how my family is suffering also due to the climate change, and also how my community is facing. And besides, there are tons of problem of climate change, I can say. So yeah, so that's all about from me. I just want to explain more but I think I don't have much time. So yeah.
Great. Awesome, Nusrat. It's good to get kind of the broader perspective, but also your family's perspective. I'm sorry to hear that it sounds like your mom is particularly suffering from this. I'm going to mute you just because I think whenever we speak and you have your camera on, yeah, if you can mute yourself, there seems to be some background noise. Bianca, who is joining us from France, but is one of our interns. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I actually had a class this semester on the environment, climate change, and just ecological literacy in general. And one thing that from the presentation stood out that I wanted to add more to was the idea of climate migrations, because in our class we were talking about how people who are forced to migrate due to climate change are not protected under any sort of refugee status at all. And so like some experts are considering, should we revise the Geneva Conventions to add climate migration to this, but then other people have given a lot of pushback to that, just because any sort of revision to such an important document could actually result in a loss of rights for many other refugees. And so I know Don was talking about climate migration specifically, and I was wondering if he had any insight on how we could better like give benefits to people who are forced to migrate due to climate change, even if they're not protected under refugee status.
And so we'll let Dawn and Lottie speak briefly before we go to Sage. Dawn and Lottie?
I wish I had an answer, a direct answer for that. And for you, Nusrat, I can say at the local immediate level, do what you can to get to higher ground. Unfortunately, that is not a good and easy answer, and it costs money and it disrupts lives. On the larger picture of change in the UN Convention, there are, if you will, small cracks in this diplomatic wall for the first time ever at this most recent COP. This is the Conference on the Parties where the UN group countries keep meeting. The first time ever, the wealthiest developed countries acknowledge that we have a problem, and they agreed to start a fund. Now, they didn't agree to give money to the fund. They just agreed to start the fund that there is an issue. So small cracks, things are happening. Well, how do you get government leaders to respond to anything? We, the people, organize. And by us becoming informed and doing what we can do, we're slowly pushing it forward. But as I said in my prepared remarks, the climate is changing. We're not going to be able to slow that substantially. Do everything green that we can, but the future is changing, but the future is not a disaster. We have the power to transform it positively. Let's do everything green that we can. Let's do things so that we work together rather than only to better ourselves personally. And when we do that, the future is hopeful. There is hope. Hope is not lost. So easy to glob on it. That's about as much as I can say there. Thank you.
Thanks, Dawn. Lottie?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I will admit I'm not an expert in climate migration, so I don't want to speak too much beyond what I can, but there are certainly cases in which there is no other option but to migrate. But I think in a lot of my experience within Kenya, a lot of the times people don't want to leave. They're leaving because they feel they have no other option. And again, kind of going back to what I was talking about in my presentation, that climate change intersects with these other stressors as well. It does not occur in isolation, in a vacuum. And so I think in these cases where people are forced to move, there is maybe the possibility of trying to think about whether there are ways to kind of enable people's own agency and ability to adapt, to allow them to stay, whether it's to address employment issues, whether it's to address issues with water. I think oftentimes in my experiences, when people can stay, they want to stay. They want to stay in their homes. But that doesn't really get at these tough questions about when those homes no longer exist because of climate change. So it's a tricky one.
Thanks to you both. Sage, you're next, joining us from Florida in the United States.
Thank you for your responses. You kind of already touched on a little bit in my question that I previously put in chat, but I'm going to still reiterate it to see, because my specific interest is more towards like foreign policy and diplomacy, of course. So bringing in this like key thought that one of our speakers did when it comes to the perspective of like families living through it, this humanized perspective. I think it's powerful, but I wanted to ask, like, what are your thoughts on countries of like the global south, that those are developing countries that are the most affected, pursuing more like legal suits or institutional reparations, basically, for the damages of their homelands? Because like, full islands have been destroyed in homelands and people are being displaced without citizenship for other countries,
So do you either Don or Lottie, do you want to quickly respond to Sage's question on legal suits?
I would say pursue it. Do what you can. The system is stacked against you, but that doesn't mean don't do it. If anything, drive you further in inspiration to try it more. But as I said, the gates are just opening. There's now a little bit of traction at the COP, it being recognized at the UN court. Go to the UN criminal, the World Court in The Hague. There are now just a few cracks, and it's starting to happen. And even the oil companies are getting this. And so the awareness is being raised, including this dialogue right here. Here we are.
Yeah, and if I recall correctly, just recently there was an important case in I think it's the European International Court of Human Rights or something like that. You guys may have the better term than, or know the correct term for the court, that essentially said that nations, in this case it was Switzerland, has a responsibility to protect its citizens from climate change, and this has repercussions, serious repercussions, because it suggests that states will be responsible for the suffering of their populations. So that's an interesting development in the power of people through courts. Lottie, you were any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I would just completely echo what Don said. I think, action on climate change is going to have to be multi-scalar and multi-level. Like, it's from the community, it's from the grassroots all the way up into, court cases and international legislation. And so I think that it's really important to be tackling this problem at all of these different levels. And to kind of bounce off what Paul was saying, in my home country, in the Netherlands, a few years back, they won a really landmark case against Shell BP for violating Dutch human rights laws and not upholding their commitment to the environment. So that was at least one of these cases in which there was a lot of really positive movements towards at least being able to kind of start making efforts towards that. So I would advocate it for 100% as well.
Thanks, Lottie. Ian, who is joining us, in Washington, D.C., is one of our interns, but he's from California in the United States, and he has a particular perspective on climate change coming from California. Ian.
Hi, thank you. Just wanted to really reiterate that I think so many of the sentiments that we've heard today are very important and very relevant to what we're discussing. I guess my experience with climate change is I'm from El Monte, California. It's 10 miles east of Los Angeles. And it's a prominently immigrant Latino and low-income community that raised me, and I saw a lot of the systemic issues that really affected my neighbors and the folks I grew up with. And I think one of the most noticeable features of my neighborhood is the sparse tree canopy. There's very few greenery and access to green spaces within my city. And that particularly is a big deal because California has seen record heat waves each summer. And having a dense tree canopy is known for reducing the temperature on the ground significantly. And while air conditioning remains a very pricey privilege, many of my neighbors are put at an increased risk of heat stroke. That's one of the great effects that we're seeing of climate change. Of course, though, these issues don't always affect everyone. The towns north of me don't exactly face these same issues as closely or as intensely. Because the towns north of me, you just drive 2 miles north, and the people who live here are white and they're much wealthier, meaning that they can afford to stay cool during our record heat waves while they have access to AC and their streets are tree lined. And I think one thing that I've really noticed, like while I was home recently, is that climate change is really just about like who has the funds to survive it, who can afford to stay cool during this. I just wanted to share that, and something that's happening here in the US. And I know that it's drastically different for so many different people across the globe.
Great, Ian. Thanks for that perspective from California. And I want to appreciate the many comments that some of you are writing in the Zoom chat. I think I want to share, speaking of solutions, we perhaps should come back to this towards the end. Jenna, who's one of our interns from the United States, who's likewise going to school in California, but is from upstate New York, in a small town in upstate New York. And she indicates some of the number of things that can be done to try to deal with the climate change problem in her comments. To our speakers, if you could, it'd be great if you can read through some of the questions, because you may want to respond, and we will be coming back to you to kind of respond to some of the questions that people have in the Zoom chat. But before we go any further with there, we have Sammy joining us from Pakistan. As you may or may not recall, Pakistan had major flooding, I believe it was last year, and it affected a large part of the country, including Sammy's own community and his family.
Yeah, hello. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you so much, Paul. First of all, I would like to start with the statistic. Like recently in 2010 flood, I'm living near to my river, that is River Kabul, which flows from Afghanistan to inside in Pakistan, and that is a very huge river. So I'm living there near at the coastal area, at the river area, and in 2010, nearly 2,200 people were killed by the Great Flood, and nearly 1.6 million people were displaced, and the property were damaged. So it happens in front of me, in front of my own house was damaged. Like we have run our business there in Pakistan, especially the northern areas where I live. It's Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, Peshawar. So there, like nearly all of my whole house was just under the whole catastrophic flood, and even the whole business wasn't in the condition that can be run again. So I can very relate with this problem, with this climate change problem, as I'm also you can see, like I'm also kind of a mountaineer, if you can see. So yeah, I climb high mountains and a kind of high altitude mountains. So when I visit there, I can literally feel the environment is changing, the climate is changing. The mountains was used to be very heavy snowy, but nowadays they are melting, and they are melting, they are gathering into the rivers, into the streams, so making the level of the streams and the level of the rivers high and high. So due to that level of highness in the rivers, I feel like that in a recent time or sooner, we will be facing more challenges through climate change, through flooding, through soil erosions. So yeah, Pakistan is basically I would say, like, it is a kind of a very catastrophic phenomena for Pakistan that are suffering from heavy floods yearly. Like in 2023, there were nearly 223 people were killed, and 5,005 to 6,000 people were displaced from their own houses, and the houses were damaged. So yeah, we are going through such a kind of difficult and challenging environment that we can't handle it. Even I'm being a media student, and as I'm having master degree, in media studies and also working on mountains, working on climate change. So working on scholarly work. So when I observe through different articles, different things in Pakistan, so there are very less work that is going to be done, that is done within our community. Like people are not preferring that much that climate change is an issue here, like due to illiteracy, due to like we are going through 56% of our country is facing illiteracy. So we don't have much awareness about it, that climate changing is places of devastating problems in our life. Like I have seen some of the females, they are giving birth to their children in the catastrophic flood. But due to such condition, they are not able to give birth to their children. There are so many health issues. Hospitals were completely full and there were no one to facilitate. So like people were helping each other by their own self. Then we got, unfortunately, and I would say fortunately, we got army or armed forces. They were helping us. So we stuck in 2010 in the Great Flood, and then again 28 August of 2023 again. I think it's yearly and eventually damaging us. So yeah, thank you.
Sammy, I particularly appreciate, so I just put in the Zoom chat, for those of you who are interested, the family stories of both Nusrat from Bangladesh, whom you heard earlier, and Sammy from Pakistan. They delivered these powerful stories about what's happening in their countries related to climate change. So you can see that they're short stories, they're about 5 minutes each, well worth watching. And so you can see that in the Zoom chat if you're interested. Sammy, I think it's particularly interesting in part because we sometimes see the photos that you take, from the mountains. They're beautiful photos of the mountains in Pakistan. But as he's pointing out, they're changing. The environment in mountainous regions is changing strikingly. You guys may be aware that the Alps used to be a great place for skiing, and that's increasingly not the case for the Alps in Europe. And I mean, in some sense, it's nice to see greenery, but it's, as you pointed out, the lack of, or the melting of the ice is aggravating the flooding that's happening in Pakistan. So really appreciate your perspective on this. Eric, who is joining us with his friends, and I really appreciate the fact that he's joining us with his friends from Burundi and has been waiting patiently to speak. Eric has an interesting perspective here coming from Burundi, and he shared this with me earlier about street vendors and the impact of climate change on street vendors. So Eric. Yes, we can hear you, but you may want to position your camera so that we can see your face. There you go. And then it's good if you stay seated. Perfect. Great to see you all.
Thank you.
Eric, I think we're having trouble hearing you. So you may want to, I'm not sure exactly what's going on, but you may want to, I'm not exactly sure what's going on, but we're having trouble hearing you.
I think in Eric's place, there are probably a lot of people with their mobile phones on. I think he's getting sound feedback, and so we're not hearing him. That might be it.
Yeah, there's.
Hello?
Yes, I think we can hear you better, Eric.
That was great. So I would like just to talk about how climate change look like here in Burundi. So last month, there was March, there was high temperature. It was increased in a way that we can't imagine. So I just read to some people who are elder. I ask, what is happening here? Because they say they're not accustomed to this, and now it's higher. It's on other level. So, but I would like just to say the impact that with the higher this temperature with the street vendors. So you know the big numbers of street vendors are women, and they why they go to street they are selling their things. So they were sick, they got sick, and also they got some headache due to the sun because they don't have some numbers to cover themselves. So they go there. I just shared the photos to Mr. Paul, just to know what is happening on the ground. And also, I'd like also to talk what is happening here in Bujumbura, the capital city of Burundi. And some floods now are rising because the heavy rain now is we are here in April, and there's heavy rain. Something now we are experiencing that the climate change is changing the way that we are not accustomed. The season that we are known before now is another thing. It's changing the way that we can imagine. And there are floods there, and the people are leaving their house. So some of the people, because they build the house there, they ask the credits there in the bank. Also, the place there, the land is so expensive. And some that get in trauma and depressions because they cannot understand, because the government say we have to protect our citizens, so you have to leave this place to go to another place. So some of them, they are just having depressions, trauma, those things like that. Yeah, that's what I can share, and that's what happened here in Burundi. Thank you.
Sorry. Eric, can you tell us a little more about how the street vendors are dealing with the heat? You said that they don't oftentimes have cover for their businesses, so they're directly impacted by the heat, the rising heat. But other ways in which you see that they're trying to deal with the rising heat or other problems.
Well, because there is no sign, the sun is scorching sun there. The street vendors, so they get some headaches. They were suffering from that because they get those problems, and also because of these problems, and also there is a lack of fuel here in our country in Burundi. There's a lack of fuel, some gases. So also people were not traveling. We're not traveling during the day because from 8 a.m. there was a scorching sun, the way that we can imagine. So people, they were not just traveling they were not just traveling around because also they were not using the cars because there is a lack of fuel. That is the problem. Having here some difficulties.
Great, Eric. Really appreciate it. I turned on the if you can actually, I think, mute yourself, because while I'm speaking, there's a lot of reverberation. Yeah, perfect. I think that stopped the kind of reverberation. But really appreciate you bringing together this group of people, young people with you. Do you want to speak briefly just to who you are, to the group that you assembled with you? Because obviously these are not just your family members, but they are your friends. Do you want to speak briefly on who is joining with you?
Those you see here, they are my brothers and sisters. So they are members of my English club, which is called the Seed of Love. They are not my brothers. So we met here in the English club. I teach them for free, and they are happy just to meet you or to be here because it was like coincidence because the time of the New York, those time, it's the time that I've been in English club. So they give me a permission to participate with them. Thank you.
Gotcha. Glad that I'm gonna mute you just for a moment here. I'm glad that this time coincided with your time for your English club. As I might have mentioned, Eric is one of our family diplomats, and he is passionate about teaching English. And so, as you might have heard, he's teaches English free currently, but is trying to develop a business teaching English in his home country. And so really appreciate seeing all of you join us, and hope that this is helpful to you in some way, and that you're able to understand us. I did turn on the captions, and I apologize for not having done that sooner, just in case that's helpful to you all. I'm hoping that you can each see the captions at the bottom of your screen that help to translate if there are any issues. It's not perfect, but it's some aid to helping to understand each other. So I want to turn to Eziani, excuse me, or Anthony. I'm just going to call you Anthony, from Nigeria, joining us from Nigeria. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear audio?
Yes, but Anthony, you may want to turn off your camera while you're speaking. I'm gonna actually, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much for this initiative. I got a call from the Learning Life to join this climate change. I'm so happy. Here in Nigeria, we have a lot of problem we are facing in Nigeria in terms of climate-related issue. Mostly the drought and reduced rainfall is one of the major problems we are facing here in Nigeria. And this have been bringing a lot of rising of air temperature, and bringing of heat wave, and as well as flooding. And in some months ago, many people have sleeping outside because of a heat wave. And we are trying to make sure that we take climate education in schools and in communities, so that people will be able to help in combating climate-related issue. And as I work as a state coordinator to Sustainable Domingo Solution Network Youth Nigeria, we have carried out community development projects in schools, and also in market and in town, visiting peoples and able to educate them on how they will help to combat the climate-related issue by planting a tree, and as well as making sure that they also have to make use of solar energy for their consumption, because we believe that Nigeria use a lot of coal, oil, and gas as one of the threats to the climate change, which rising a lot of emissions that causes a lot of problems to the world. And Nigeria make use of it, and we don't have much solar, because the solar panel here in Nigeria is very costly, and the poor people cannot have money to afford it. So we are trying to make sure that we are appealing to the government of Nigeria, so that if they can able to transmit to solar energies across all the key industries in Nigeria, so that people will be living. And most key finding that we find out to the people in Nigeria is that most people are cutting down their trees without planting another one, because the trees give us much oxygen, and also provide food for us and give us a ventilated air, and also minimize the level of heat wave within our community. So we are trying to make sure that everybody in their families are having tree plantings, and also have a climate garden within their backyard, to enable us to have a ventilated air and reduce a lot of heat wave, because we don't have much technology here in Africa and in Nigeria in terms of heat wave, like other countries like United States of America, who are using underground to store some of their emissions, so that it will not be very effective to their peoples. So we're making use of tree plantings, and encouraging people not to cut tree, and to planting, if they cut, they should have to plant another one. We have taken all this community development project, and making sure that students are most our targets, because we know that climate education is very important, that students are eager to transmit what they have learned to their houses, to transmit make sure that their families knows about how they will join hands to combat the climate change. Like I've traveled about 5 kilometers away from Nigeria to come home so that my mother will be able to see what is happening. Because my mother always faced a heat wave, and he told me that he must join us to see what is happening and how we can address this heat wave. And in where I'm working right now as administrative officer in my university, I found out that students are not even sleeping at night. Maybe during the time of something like in the afternoon, in 12 p.m., 12 noon, 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. There's a lot of heat wave. Even in the classes, they are not feeling comfortable. And even that is exposing some of the students to be, indecent dressings because of the heat. And we also working on that and how we can address it, and by playing the families to make sure that they have a tree planting, because we found out that there's a lot of cutting down trees in Nigerians and people are not planting it back, knowing that we don't have much technology, and this is only local technology that we can use to combat the climate-related issue. So I want to thank you people, and I thank the speakers for bringing this idea and making sure that we also to make sure that we combat climate change by making sure that we agree with we also work mostly on the Paris Agreement to limiting the temperature rise from 1.5 degrees Celsius pre-industrial level, and this should be the most important thing. And I want to be very happy to thank you people for bringing this idea. Thank you all.
Really, thank you for joining us on this, Anthony. It sounds like you're actually involved in climate change action, right? And you're doing this full time?
Yes, I'm working on that. I'm a state coordinator. I have a lot of young people working with me here in Nigeria. We have already initiated some projects, and we have the pictures and the videos with me here. Thank you.
And do you feel like a lot of young people in Nigeria are really motivated to try to address climate change? Because it's
yes.
Okay.
We have a lot of vibrant youths that are eager to, combat the climate-related issue. We have been working voluntary, and most of them are very active working on that, knowing that climate change is not something that someone can do. It's affecting everybody. It takes some time before to happen, but at least now it happens regularly because of human activities like overpopulation, industrialization, and as well as other emission and coal, oil and gas burning every day. So there's a lot of youth that are here that are eager to work extremely to reach any level that they can use to help and combat the climate issue. And they are with me. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Anthony. That's really helpful to get your perspective from Nigeria. Some of you may know, some of you may not know, Nigeria is the biggest country in terms of population in Africa. I believe the population is around 200 million people in Nigeria. So, and it's currently undergoing some economic distress as the government is trying to improve things for people, but in the process making things difficult for a lot of people. Actually, one of our family diplomats, Chirunim, who's not with us today, is from Nigeria, from Port Harcourt, and so his family's personally suffering from the economic conditions there. I want to turn to Francisca, and if I remember correctly, Francisca, you are from Ghana, but you're going to graduate school in the United States. Is that right?
Yes, Paul. I'm Francisca, originally from Ghana, but I'm currently in Nebraska, Lincoln, working on my PhD in global family health and well-being.
Oh, okay, great. So
I'm already here.
And Francisca, can you turn on your camera? It would be great to see you while you're speaking. I think your connection is good.
Yes, sorry.
Right.
Yeah, so thank you everyone for the great presentation. I really enjoyed learning, and also I appreciate the fact that we talked about family and the impact on climate change on families as well. Most of the time when you hear discussions on climate change, it's like, oh, climate, communities, but we tend to leave out the struggles that families go through. And so I appreciate that. And yes, I want to share the point from Ghana. I know I grew up in Ghana, and until 2021 that I moved to the US. So I know when I was in in undergrad, we used to talk a lot about climate change, and there were a lot of initiatives about tree planting and like different things. But at some point, it just went off, like it slowed down. So it was just like everybody is just focused on life, like trying to get through. I know it just died off slowly. And recently, there've been a lot of like issues around like droughts in some part of like the Volta like region, like as part of Ghana, and people are like displaced. Like, a lot of people, like it's my hometown, so like I'm very passionate about it. And some people don't want to leave. They are so attached to those, like where that's where they grew up, that's where their families are and everything. So it's hard for them to let go and move on. And also, those issues have happened previously, and it was like they always had some ways to deal with it. It just goes off after some time, but now it's like becoming worse, and it's like, do we leave? Where do we go next? And there's also like some sort of like language barrier as well. Like there are different tribal groups in Ghana, so the Voltarians speak Ewe, and even within Ewe there are different variations. So if you're moving to the south also is like Accra is a big city, it's like overpopulated, a lot of like rural urban migration. So it's like a lot of people are in the urban area, and it's like very packed. Do you want to go leave everything, go live in the slum? What do you do? Like what jobs? Like there's limitations. How do you even navigate the system in that south? So it's just a big challenge. And now students can't go to school. There's no good access to healthcare and all those kind of things. So it's just like compounded stresses going on. So you will see videos with people still living in the like flood area, like just in this space. And also I know for the heat waves, there's also issue of heat waves in the south because it has a lot of like industrialization, like a lot of like big manufacturing companies, and also because it's very packed, overpopulated. And that's where my small family lives. Like my grandmother lives there, my dad, and every day the calls like it's very hot in Ghana right now. It's like, yeah, I don't know how to like relate with it. And I also want to help, but it's very difficult. And it's also expensive. We can't afford air conditioning, like electricity bills are going high. You also want to save money for food and do other things, but you also can't stand the heat. During the day, you are stressed out. During the night, you can't sleep. And there's also a lot of health issues coming up, like skin, and also like just overall, like just different kind of health issues coming up. So it's very hard. And sometimes it's just sad, like just being not being able to like do something to like solve that issue, because I feel like, oh, you can't take a big air conditioning, take it home, save it. But I feel like they will still step out, they will have to navigate, go to places. And also, do you always have to like pay for the electricity bill? So it's just like, yeah, those are kind of the experience for my family currently, like especially with the heat waves. And also I could see that it's also affecting little children, young children, like early childhood, the preschools and all those things. So it's, yeah, I don't know, it's very good. I know we have a lot of discussion. We talk a lot about this thing. Yeah, so everyone can relate. Everyone's in Accra. It's not easy. Yeah, it's something that is raising a lot of concern, but a lot of people are not talking about it currently because it's the country is also going through a lot of political stuff happening, and it's the year or like we vote election year. So it's also like, yeah, we don't really like want to, is that something we want to address right now, or we want to like focus on getting the election for the politics as well? People want to get in power, use the money for their own personal gain, and it's not really addressing the issues of the country. So it's just, yeah, I don't know, maybe there will be some miracle from international countries to like step in and help, but yeah, it's just so sad.
Mhm. Francisca, it would be great if you contact me for us to talk. It would be great for you to be one of our family diplomats from Ghana, considering that it sounds like your studies are well aligned with what we do. So I'd love for you to contact me and for us to talk. But really appreciate your perspective, giving us your perspective from somebody from Ghana. We actually have another one of our family diplomats who is from Ghana. Aaron, I don't know if you want to chime in at some point. You're welcome to do so now. Please do raise your hand electronically if you'd like to participate. We have Joe Tolles, who is joining us from the United States, is next. And then after Joshua Kisubika from Uganda.
Thanks, Paul. I mean, I love having these dialogues because the thing that's always missing in a lot of these academic discussions, to a point where it feels something, is the impact it has on families and the people that are living in that. I sit here sort of shamed in that I don't think about this. And you know, I guess somebody said it before, it's sort of like the haves and the have-nots, and who can survive these crises because they have the means. And I'm not happy about that. But you know, I love hearing about this, and it really activates me, but it also frustrates me, and I'm sort of a problem solver. And so my mind immediately goes to sort of the unanswerable question, or a question that may not take 5 minutes to answer. But I have a question about, for the experts. I think fairly, and thanks, Ian, I think brought up California. And it's like, I never thought, like, I don't think about California in that situation. I am intellectually know that there are areas in this country that struggle more than none. But in the United States, I think this issue is largely ignored. We pay attention to the short-term crisis control, and there's sort of like an overwhelming conscious public denial by our politicians that there is no climate issues there. And I really think about, and this may be sort of conspiracy theorist, because I've worked in areas where politics and the actions of politics have moved almost intentionally to displace people and to recapture resources that are that they can use for in a better way, as opposed to putting money into mitigating these long-term issues. And so I guess my question is how I can't not think about how intertwined politics is in this issue, and how, at least in the United States, people that are our leaders fight real hard. And I just, again, I think this is probably a very long conversation, but what are the political issues and not even just issues, problems that really make this problem not go away?
A good question, and glad that you bring politics into this, because of course ultimately governments have a major role in climate change, for better or worse. I do though want to hold off. We have just 10 minutes left, and we are going to return to Dawn and to Lottie at the end, to have them comment. So Dawn and Lottie, if you can just be prepared to wrap things up, but also just to respond to some of the questions that have been posed, would really appreciate it. And perhaps also just end on a positive note. And I think positive and also specific about the particular ways in which climate change can be addressed, not just by governments and businesses, but also by individuals and groups. So if you can come to that. But before we turn to Dawn and to Lottie again, I want to ask Joshua Kisubika, who's joining us from Uganda, to give us his perspective.
Yes, Uganda. just like any other country, is also facing climate change. We've had heat waves here. We've had dry spells. We've had heavy rains that are causing mudslide and landslides in Bududa district, that is in Uganda here. And I remember in 2015, I happened to work on a project, climate change project. You know, women were suffering because of the dry spells that were affecting their animals. 80% of the population here in Uganda, of course, are involved in agriculture. Therefore, when climate hits, that definitely affects 80% and more of the population here in Uganda. So the women had no alternative, had nowhere to run on how they can adapt to the climate change that affect their families. So we positioned, I remember I was just fresh from my undergraduate, I just completed university. And then I started on this climate change projects. I was trained by the government as the youth to train the women in the villages and other fellow youth on this number of technologies. We trained the youth, especially in the cattle corridors where there was the dry spells, turning the waste materials like the waste material to conserve them as feeds for their animals, so that when the dry spells hit, they can be able to feed their animals and get milk, feed their babies, and get that income. It's a cycle, because this cow is a source of income to the family. It's what they get money to feed their family. So when the cow dies because of climate change, so really eventually they will also die. So we train them in this number of technologies, doing silage, that's turning sweet potato and keeping it for a long time, so that in the dry spells you can be able to feed your animals, your cows, pigs, and sorry to mention for the Muslim, but and also hay. These are you turn the dry grass, you keep the dry grass. I think in the United or in the developed countries you've already seen this, but here in Uganda, people couldn't believe that the animals could eat the dry grass, because we are in the green. Uganda is a green country, so they couldn't believe animals could eat this dry grass. So we could teach them this number of technologies that they can keep hay and then feed their animals during the dry spells. So, but more has to be done, and that's my experience with the climate and adaptation technologies we employed, teaching the youth and then scaling it to other parts of the country.
It's really interesting that you likewise, it sounds like, were involved in kind of education work on climate change in Uganda, Josh, just like Anthony.
That was in 2015 when I did that project on climate change.
So thanks, Joshua. We're going to turn back now to Don and to Lottie to kind of wrap things up and give us some comments and responses to some of the questions. Really appreciate that a lot of you have been contributing to the Zoom chat conversation. We actually saved those conversations and we're going to be sharing them out. So it's great to see such lively conversation between you all in the Zoom chat. So Don and Lottie, you have the last words. I will at the end just wrap things up by reminding you of the next dialogues. But Don or Lottie, who wants to go first?
I'd be happy to go first, and Lottie can have the final word. To respond directly to some of the questions that I also hope help us wrap up, and I'm going to try and keep it short and sweet. Mountains are incredibly important. Mountains supply water to more than half the world's populace and contain literally about a third of the world's populace. 10 or 15 years ago, the thought was, oh, the glaciers are melting, we're going to run out of water. Okay, it turns out when those statements came up 10, 15 years ago, there was some real studies done in the high mountains of Asia, and it turns out, yes, the glaciers are melting, but the glaciers only supply about 5% of the amount of water. It's mostly the snow melt. And in the case of the Ganges River, it's the direct rainfall from the monsoon rains. The rest of the time in the Indus, the Amu Darya, the Sir Darya, the Brahmaputra, it's snow melt, and there is less snow. This is a monumental problem that is indeed affecting Pakistan and all of Central and South Asia. This is going to take monumental training, just as Joshua is doing or has done in Kenya. These kinds of programs and educating young people and changing methods and updating old, tired, leaky infrastructure. This is what we got to do in order to continue to help to support people. This is where much of our investment needs to go. There's always going to be greed. Individual players are always going to chase after greed. We have to try and fight that everywhere to improve the infrastructure so it improves life for us all. Now, having said that, education is core. And I want to say in this country, there are some smart people that have caught on to that. And in this country, I like to do this as a quiz. You guys don't know, most of you don't live here. Which is the largest owner of buildings in the country? And it turns out the most square footage of rooftops and land in the country in built infrastructure, it's schools. Where should the place be where we have the first solar panel green energy projects? And in the schools in this country anyway, there's a fair bit of open land. Every school needs to have all of its rooftops with solar panels and have in the corner a wind generator, and they need to have evening training programs for adults. We should be, and there are literally California's doing this, the state of Massachusetts is doing this, and I hope other countries start doing this for schools to become the models, the physical model of how you do it, and then teach the young people. Don't just have the technicians come and build the stuff on the building. You get the kids involved, teach them why are we doing it, how are we doing it. So education and involving the schools in it is a huge thing. And that is raising awareness. I put in the chat, certainly USAID, other development donor organizations, countries are advocating for this kind of training in the schools and all the future education programs to include climate. I've chatted too long. Thank you so much for your time. There is hope. Okay, there's my ultimate message. There is hope. As our societies change, let's change it for the better and try and get corruption and greed out of it as we can. Thank you.
Thanks, Don. Lottie.
Yeah, thanks, Don. That was really insightful. Yeah, I guess in my like ending remarks, I wanted to kind of reflect back on what Joe said about climate change is absolutely a political issue, just as much as it's a biophysical one, just as much as it's a social issue or an economic issue. And that obviously means that it comes with a lot of structural barriers and constraints to building a world, a more just world, and building a world that we kind of want to see. And the battle is difficult, of course, but I want to encourage us not to underestimate our own agency as individuals, and not to underestimate the power of collective action to pushing for the kinds of change that we want to see. So I think that's sort of my first takeaway, or if I would like to leave you all with a takeaway is not to forget your own agency and the power of collective action and coming together. And you all are already building those networks and foundations through this program. And then the second thing that I reflect a lot about in my own work is I think there tends to sometimes be an over-reliance on like Western technical solutions to a lot of these problems. And I think that tends to overshadow the power of locally driven solutions, local knowledge, indigenous perspectives. I think that there's a lot of power in those perspectives as well towards building a more climate resilient future. And so I would, I'm an advocate and a proponent of bringing forward locally driven solutions, bringing forward perspectives and expertise and knowledge of groups that have traditionally been silenced or marginalized or not, pulled into the front. So I think there's hope in that too. So I think you all on this call are already on the right track to helping us sort of envision a more hopeful world. So yeah, thank you all so much. I really enjoyed this conversation. Learned a lot from everyone.
Awesome, Lottie. And that is a great segue to underscore part of the reason why we're having these conversations is to build family diplomacy across the world, right? Families are widely valued across the world. They're deeply impacted by all kinds of issues from mental health to climate change. Hence we need to bring families into the discussion and the ways in which they're impacted and the ways in which they can have an effect on these major problems that we're having, like climate change. So these dialogues are intended to kind of continue to build awareness, connect more people, like Francisca from Ghana, who I'm looking forward to speaking with, and others who might want to serve as family diplomats, right? To represent your family and other families in your communities, so that you can speak more powerfully, right? It's one thing to speak as an individual, it's another thing to speak as a family. Having heard my partner's daughter, in some sense, warms you guys to this otherwise white guy who's just talking on his own and so on. It underscores that we are not alone. We are part of families, and those families matter tremendously to us, and are impacted by all of these major issues. So I want to finish off by showing you a couple of things. One is photos and I think that Eric from Burundi is unfortunately he had to skip out, but he was the one who was joining with his compatriots in Burundi, and he shared a couple of photos with us with regards to these street vendors in his community. This is one of the photos, and as you can see in this photo and this photo, they are directly exposed to increasing heat with no cover, and that can lead to all kinds of issues. So these are the kinds of people that we want to represent, right? As Lottie was pointing out, we need to hear these voices of people across the world, and family diplomacy is one powerful way to do that through this. So lastly, I want to just give you guys a sense of the next dialogue. So the next dialogue is, so there are two more dialogues. The next dialogue is May 12th. So same day, it's Sunday at noon, at 10 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. Eastern time, Washington, D.C. time. And it will be focused on gender-based violence. So we hope you will join us for that dialogue and offer your perspective, and that you'll invite others to join us as well. So I'm going to stop sharing and wish you all a good rest of your Sunday, and thank you for your participation. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.